So good evening and a warm welcome to another Big Thinking Talk. And these are a series of TED-style talks designed and developed as part of Radley's 175th year of celebrations. These talks are designed to reveal the breadth of thinking that sits within the Radley community and feature perspectives from Dons, Old Radleians and Radley parents and boys. Their aim is to inspire and to challenge and to encourage us all to reflect on our future world. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping items from me. Please keep your microphones on mute so that we don't distract the speakers. If you want to ask a question during the talk, then feel free to pop it on the Q&A section and that will be fielded towards the end of the talk in the Q&A session. The event will be recorded for use on our website, so please be aware of that. We want to share it with those who are unable to attend today. And now, stepping up to our virtual podium, I would like to introduce Jamie Arbib, who is the co-founder of Rethinking, a not-for-profit think tank that produces research on technology disruptions and their impact on society. He works with governments, businesses, and investors to prepare for these impacts. Tonight, Jamie is going to talk about rethinking humanity. He believes we're on the cusp of some of the most consequential transformation of human civilization in our history. And as a result, it is vital that we adapt and think differently about our future and about our humanity. After the talk, Yorston, physics don and digital expert, will facilitate the Q&A session. So please do load questions up onto the chat function as we go. And now, finally, that's enough from me. Over to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. And it's great to be here this evening. Thank you for inviting me. So I left Radley in 1990 with no real clear plan. And I find myself, having just turned 50, still without a plan. I never thought I'd end up doing what I am today. Occasionally I get referred to as a futurist, which is a term I hate. I have no better idea than anyone else on this call about what's coming. But I think what we do have at Rethink X is a different perspective, certainly on where we are today, maybe a different way to explain the seeming chaos of the world around us, and also a different idea of the possibilities coming into the future. So I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of background. I guess a part of my journey that led to the foundation of Rethink X about 8 years ago, and then look forward at some of the technological changes that are coming and think about how they might help us solve some of the kind of seemingly intractable problems that we have in society today. So I was doing some work out in Washington with the US military about 8 years ago or so. And as part of that, I got invited to attend a scenario planning day that they were running. And they were asking the question, what will it mean for geopolitics and for US military capabilities if we transition off fossil fuels quicker than we're expecting? And they invited a bunch of experts along to kind of brief them and lay out their scenarios. And it was an extraordinary day. It was probably the most intimidating room I've ever been in, actually. It was full of kind of admirals and generals and just incredible questioning. But I sat through this day, and 8 of the 10 experts who came along from kind of big, august institutions, the State Department, BP, Exxon, and so on, all had pretty much identical forecasts for the adoption of electric vehicles, the adoption of solar PV, and batteries and so on, looking out to say 2050 or so. And they had these kind of low incremental straight line forecasts that saw even by 2050, maybe 20% adoption in the most aggressive forecasts. I remember this guy called Tony Seba, who teaches technology disruption at Stanford, getting up when it was his turn to talk and saying, look, this isn't how technology disruption unfolds. It's not this kind of slow incremental progression. It's rapid, it's non-linear. It's the S-curve of technology disruption that we see in technologies time and time again. And these disruptions are over by the 2030s. We'll have a fully renewable electric power system and a fully electric vehicle fleet. He said, if you're going to make your decisions based on these faulty forecasts that these big institutions are giving you, you're going to make some major mistakes. And I basically said the same thing. And I remember walking out of that room and taking Tony for a coffee and sitting down and talking about everything from healthcare to food and agriculture to finance and banking, as well as transport and energy. And in our view, we felt that we were on the cusp of fundamental transformations of each of those sectors. And yet governments, businesses, investors were totally unaware of how quickly they might happen and how profoundly they might affect society. And this matters because if you want to make decisions today about the future, if you want to plan an energy system or a pension system, you need to have relatively accurate expectations about what's coming, or at least the possibilities that are coming. And so we went away, and after a few months of talking, we set up Rethinking, which is a not-for-profit research organization, really with the aim of providing better analysis for decision makers across society to take better decisions. And so I want to share a little bit of that work with you today. But to start, I just want to give you a little complex systems 101, because at the heart of our work, at the heart of the framework we've built to understand what's coming, is an understanding of complex systems. Now, it sounds scary, it sounds intimidating as a word, but it's actually pretty simple. And understanding complex systems can throw enormous light on how change can unfold. So I'm going to use the climate system as an example to try and explain. So the climate system is like any other complex system. The human body's one, any sector of the economy are complex systems as well. And the process of change and the pattern of change is the same in them all. The pattern that you see is one of kind of incremental progress or equilibrium, stasis over long periods of time, interspersed with periods of very rapid change where the system will flip from one state into another. So the climate's a great example, and we're currently in an equilibrium phase. Right? So we're emitting huge quantities of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere today, but most of those greenhouse gases are being sucked up by the oceans or by plant growth. Right? Then what's called negative feedback loops. They act to constrain change. So we emit huge quantities of greenhouse gases, but the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gas is not rising by nearly as much as it would have done in the absence of those forces. And so that's keeping us in equilibrium. That's keeping us in a stable state, which is great. The worry comes, though, when we get to a point when we exceed certain thresholds. And when we do that, we trigger a tipping point where those negative feedback loops begin to break down. So they no longer constrain change. And we trigger what are known as accelerating feedback loops that act to accelerate change. So we get to a certain point in time and the oceans warm up and stop absorbing carbon dioxide, and instead of absorbing it, they release it. But also we see the ice caps melting and more of the Earth's energy getting trapped in our atmosphere. We might see the Arctic tundra melting, releasing methane. These things are reinforcing. They lead to increases in greenhouse gas emissions, increases in concentrations in the atmosphere, and ultimately increases in temperature. And that's the worry, is that we hit this tipping point and we trigger runaway climate change, and we tip very quickly over the course of a few decades into a new system several degrees higher. So that's the essence of complex systems. It's really a battle between the forces that constrain change and the forces that accelerate change. And the same processes work in the economy when we think about how new technologies come into markets. So I'm going to start very quickly and run you through just 3 sectors of the economy that we've covered: transport, energy, and food, and give you a flavor of what might be coming and how these disruptions might unfold, and then begin to look at what that might mean for society more generally. So first of all, transportation. So I think we're all aware that there's sort of an electric vehicle revolution going on as we speak, and that's driven by the cost of electric vehicles. We've seen battery costs drop by 90% over the last decade. So electric vehicles are becoming more and more disruptive. They started at the top of the market, disrupting expensive high-end cars. And as they've come down in price and the capabilities have improved, they're opening up more and more of the market, and they're beginning to disrupt the middle of the market. And we expect within 2 or 3 years, they'll disrupt the bottom of the market. We're seeing in China and India already electric vehicles that can do a couple of 100 miles of range, costing less than $10,000. So this is a revolution that's really driven by economics, not by government policy or any other reasons. It's raw economics that drives disruption. It's the cost and capability of technology. And what happens as demand increases, as people begin buying electric vehicles, is you trigger these feedback loops, and they're both vicious cycles for the old industry and a virtuous cycle for the new. So for the new industry, increasing demand leads to increasing economies of scale, which leads to lower cost, which leads to more investment in the new system, which leads to sort of government support moving and regulation changing. And you get this kind of virtuous cycle where demand increases and costs come down, and there's this continual improvement that helps drive change. And the existing industry, gasoline cars, in this instance, go into the reverse. We're seeing demand drying up. We're seeing economies of scale begin to reverse. We'll soon see costs. We've already seen margin compression, and we'll see costs begin to rise. We're seeing all the investment that legacy automakers are making move from investing in gasoline cars, which are no longer improving, into electric and autonomous vehicles. And so very quickly, we'll see this disruption play out. And we think by 2030, that no more new vehicles will be gasoline. And that won't be because of government bans, it will purely because of these processes of disruption. And that's pretty typical of a disruption. We see between 10 and 15 years, a total transformation of the market. There's no halfway point. There's no kind of prospect of the two living together in tandem. It happens because you drive these feedback loops that lead to the destruction of the old and the improvement of the new. But that's just the first phase of disruption. The second phase is much more interesting because as we get vehicle autonomy developed, we'll no longer need a driver. Now, the big difference between an electric vehicle and a gasoline vehicle is that there are no moving parts really. There are 20 moving parts compared to 2,000 moving parts in a gasoline vehicle. So there's much less to go wrong. There's no degradation. We're seeing vehicles designed today that can last for 1 million miles. And that includes the battery. And that's transformational. In the private ownership model where we all own our own cars, it's kind of useless, right? We do 10,000, 12,000 miles a year. It would last for 100 years. So we don't get the benefit of that. But when you go into what we call transport as a service, essentially a robo-taxi type market, where these cars are used all the time, that's really useful. And so these cars can last 1 million miles. You can spread the upfront cost of the car over 1 million miles, right? Each mile costs just 1/1,000,000th of the cost of the car. Now, the cost of repairs and maintenance are far, far lower. The cost of electricity to power them is far, far lower. So the cost of transportation will drop, we think, by an order of magnitude over the current model we have today. And it will get so low, certainly in cities where these cars are used a lot, where actually we think entirely new business models will emerge that allow the platforms that provide the service, the transport service, to monetize the user in a whole host of ways and offer transport for free, in the same way that Facebook and Google are free to the user. They monetize you in other ways. And that's transformational, and that will lead to an even more rapid disruption and turn the market, the transport market, totally on its head, and obviously have cascading impacts on the oil market and all other kinds of attached markets to the transport industry. Very quickly, the energy disruption, similar disruption, also driven by the cost of batteries. So the batteries that have been feeding our electric vehicles have dropped so far now that they're becoming competitive in grid storage. They're beginning to disrupt parts of the electric power market. But really the disruption is driven by the combination of solar, wind, and batteries. And this is a disruption that's really badly understood. So it starts again with cost. So we've seen batteries come down by 90% over a decade, solar by 80%, wind by about 50%. And we expect similar drops over the next decade. Solar in most parts of the world is the cheapest form of power. And so we've seen the new build market for electric power largely disrupted. Over 50% of new build power generation is now renewables. But actually it's a fundamentally different beast. And this is a key element of disruption. The market that emerges, the other side of the disruption, looks nothing like the market that existed previously. So when you build a fully renewable electric power system, the way you do it, the way you get through the kind of northern winter, which is the problem when solar resources are low, is that you massively overbuild generating capacity. You essentially supersize the system. And because the cost of solar is dropping so much, it will still be by far the cheapest way to meet demand. And what you get when you do that, and you've got this huge amount of generating capacity to try and minimize the amount of storage you need, is you get a market that behaves totally different. For the rest of the year, this electric power system produces far too much power, just a superabundance, essentially, of free energy. Now, when you look at it through the lens of the old, you see that as a problem. And we're talking today about turning off the windmills or curtailing the solar because we have too much of it. But actually, it's a huge opportunity. We'll use that. That incentive of zero cost power will transform industry after industry. So we could use that electricity, for instance, to make hydrogen, or we could use it in steel production, or we could use it in, I mean, almost any kind of high energy use industry that we have today where demand is shiftable. But actually, it will enable entirely new industries as well. Things like vertical farming that today are, far too expensive because of the energy costs. We'll be able to benefit from that, and it might crystallize a whole new industry there, and a host of other industries. In the same way, the internet, when it came along and offered essentially zero cost information and communications, triggered a host of other new opportunities that we couldn't have imagined at the outset. And we think the same thing will happen with electric power. We'll end up with a vastly lower cost system that is more resilient, not dependent on any foreign energy supplies, and is vastly cheaper with no emissions. And it will be driven again by the economics. Now, the food disruption's kind of super interesting in some ways, and it's the one that's in its inception, but it's a fascinating disruption because we're beginning to learn new ways, essentially, to produce proteins without growing animals. So it's really a disruption of livestock farming that I'm talking about. And there are a number of ways of doing it, but the key way is a process called precision fermentation. It's not that dissimilar to brewing beer. And what we do is we hack microbes to produce a protein. And it can be any protein with any properties that we want it to be. So we can design, for instance, human milk proteins. In fact, the first protein to produce this way was human insulin. So back in the early 80s, scientists managed to produce human insulin by using microbes. And that replaced insulin that came from the pancreas of a pig or a cow. And so in the old days, it took about 50,000 animals to provide a kilo of insulin. And over time, and it was obviously an inferior product. But as we began to produce human insulin in this way, obviously a much better product, the cost came down. And so the first kilo cost about $1 billion back in the 1980s. And today we've dropped to below the cost of $100 per kilo. So it's been on this extraordinary cost curve. And within a few years, we'll be down below about $10 per kilo, which is where it becomes competitive with milk proteins and other animal meat proteins. So we're about to see, towards the end of this decade, a massive process of disruption of animal farming, which will be transformational because this new system requires a fraction of the land input. It requires a fraction of the energy. It requires a fraction of the cost as well, because the cost of producing food will be much, much cheaper, and there'll be no volatility or no security issues around the food system as well. It's a totally different model of production. Instead of kind of growing the whole plant and animal and breaking it down into all the different parts and things that we need, we're turning the model on its head. We're starting with a single molecule, essentially, and building up from there. And that kind of dictates how the disruption will play out. We'll start with the kind of single molecules of the milk proteins, the casein, the whey, and so on. And over time, we'll disrupt other parts of that value chain. And we think by the late 2030s, pretty much that whole market will be disrupted. Because what happens when you disrupt all these subsidiary products is the cost of the remaining products go up. A cow is broken down. There's a thing called carcass balancing, where the cow is broken down into hundreds of different products. And as you disrupt, say, the leather market, and we produce leather through these alternative processes, the hide might become a cost to dispose of rather than an asset to sell. And as you can't sell more and more pieces, and you're left with just a steak eventually, the cost of that steak will be enormous compared to where it is today. And so the cost of the old goes up as the cost of the new continues to come down. And that's why we think there's a hugely rapid disruption here. So together, those disruptions are going to have a profound effect. and they're going to have profound impacts that cascade across society and kind of affect everything. And this is really why we set up Rethink X, so we could see and anticipate how quickly these things might happen and how profoundly they might affect society. Because these disruptions don't happen in isolation. They happen together. We have to understand how they interact, how the energy market will transform all kinds of other sectors of the economy and so on. And when we look at, say, climate change, we see it in a very different way. So climate change, yes, is a problem, but we think we have all the solutions, and that actually market forces will deliver most of that solution. So, transport, energy, and food together account for about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we see a transformation of those industries over the next 2 decades. And yes, there will be some legacy emissions that are hard to abate, hard to disrupt, but we'll have options for what we do. Because as we disrupt livestock farming, we'll change the use of 80% of our farmland. Like 80% of our land goes to supporting livestock, either through pasture land or by producing food to feed these animals. And that's profound because we have choices. We can reforest that land. We can rewild that land. It can become a carbon sink, and it can provide an opportunity for the communities, the farmers and communities affected, to actually have far better jobs as stewards of that land. And that's cheap carbon abatement, essentially, or carbon sequestration. But low-cost energy as well opens us enormous options to sequester carbon at much lower costs than we're anticipating. We think there are a number of ways that we can use these new technologies and the superabundance of energy to sequester carbon at almost any scale we can imagine. And by 2040 or so, we'd expect the ceiling on a carbon price to be about $10, that we can sequester as much as we want. Below that, in ways that have little adverse impact elsewhere. And industries like shipping, that we think are hard to abate today, will be disrupted because the need for shipping is disrupted. As we stop transporting huge quantities of fossil fuels, of cars and animal products around, and production localizes much more because we automate labor and we're not taking advantage of cheap Chinese labor anymore. We'll see a transformation of the economy, and we'll move to a world where the physical flows of resources and goods through that system diminish dramatically to be replaced by vast information flows. And that's really what's happening, because this is a transformation of the system. We're moving for a kind of centralized world based on scarce resources, based essentially on extracting and exploiting scarce resources from as far afield as we can reach, to one where all the inputs into that system are available locally, everywhere in the world and in abundance. It's the molecules, the cells, the photons and electrons that we need to build pretty much anything we want, that we can harness locally. And we can share the information, the blueprints and the plans across the globe. So a totally different kind of structure to our production system, and a far lower cost and far less impactful system. So the costs of the goods we need drop dramatically, meaning that we solve poverty, we solve inequality, we have all kinds of different possibilities that emerge. Geopolitics becomes a far less acute issue. We're not dependent on scarce resources, constrained to certain parts of the world. The transformation, essentially, of the causes of war, ideology and resource scarcity, transformed by this new system. And ultimately, it's a system that might transform the way we organize ourselves and the way we govern ourselves. Because, and I'm not going to go too far off beat here, so I'll try and bring it back actually a little bit, because I know I'm running out of time. But if you're interested in hearing more about the impacts on society more generally, we wrote a book a couple of years ago called Rethinking Humanity that you can find on our website, and you can download it for free. It's available there. We look at what this new system means for the way we govern and organize ourselves, because it's profound, because there's kind of centralization and hierarchy. Even the nation state are kind of constructs that emerged out of that old extraction-based system. We needed scale and reach to be able to access the resources and the labor that we needed to fire our system. But as we move to this much more distributed system where the resources and the people and the labor, the people and planet are available in abundance locally. It's transformational. Governance structures we would expect to change to mirror that over time. Now, it's going to be a long and slow process, but in some ways, kind of nation states become somewhat redundant in this world. At least, over the long periods, they serve different purposes. So I think I'll just try and finish by saying, look, the world can seem a kind of crazy and scary place today. And when you're kind of down in the weeds, it feels like there's a lot of turmoil, but what's really happening and what we're seeing across the board is really the end of an age, the collapse of an old system that spans every sector of the economy, and the emergence of a new system built on fundamentally different principles. And that's always going to be a difficult period. It always has been in history. But at the end of that process, if we get through that difficult period of time, a world exists that is potentially much more resilient, much more self-sufficient, much more sustainable, much more prosperous, and much more equitable. But it's going to be a rocky road to get there. Thank you very much, Ian. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, it wouldn't be fun unless somebody was on mute. Jamie, that was fantastic. Fascinating and challenging in equal measure. And as you say, scary and crazy place in the world. The good news is that lots of people are asking lots of intelligent questions. The bad news is I'm going to ask a couple of questions of my own first before we turn to those. You left Radley in 1990. I think I taught your younger brother because I arrived shortly after you'd gone, and I wasn't avoiding the place because of you, obviously. But in 1990, I was just getting dragged into the first Gulf War as an electronic warfare officer. And one of my observations would be that pretty much all the tech that we were playing with in 1990 is now in my iPhone. And you were talking about the fact that, one of the things that had really influenced you was that meeting in Washington with the American military. And I'm very struck by the fact that, what happened in the Second World War massively influenced the next sort of 30, 40 years. And it tends to be the transformational changes of warfare that then drift into our lives. And I wonder what you think is going to come out of Ukraine as a result of that. What is happening in Ukraine that is going to start changing the world. You did allude to the idea that there wouldn't be any national borders anymore, and I'm not quite sure what Putin is going to make of not having any national borders to cross.
I think that's a long way off in many ways. But I mean, Ukraine. I actually, going back to that meeting, that military meeting, I remember this. Who's now my co-founder, Tony Sieber, asking the U.S. military if they had a plan for Russia in the 2020s. Because he saw peak oil in 2020. That was his forecast, and that places like Saudi Arabia, other places in the Middle East, places that are dependent on these resources, as they begin to see that opportunity unwind, become restless in many ways, and so that's obviously a concern. I think I can't explain the Ukraine war. Right? This is one man who's taken certain decisions, and you can never predict that. But what's interesting, what I find interesting from the edge looking at this, is you can see elements of this new kind of distributed world emerging. Right? So you see the Russians and their supposedly incredible hacking operation being completely outclassed by this distributed organization or sort of unorganization that's emerged of anonymous and various other hackers coming in from around the world and overwhelming the Russians, who are this kind of centralized hierarchical organization. They can't compete. We've seen a number of military units kind of self-assemble, self-organize, come together from international veterans and form together. We've seen sort of crowdsourced funding come together. And that's the kind of, elements of the distributed world that you can see. And it's much more powerful than kind of centralization and hierarchy. And that's really the Russians' problem. And I read today that Putin is taking kind of low-level military decisions. It's a real kind of command and control structure. And you can never compete with a much more distributed network system. And that's why I think these kind of centralized hierarchical structures, not just countries, but businesses and other organizations that are built that way will just be outcompeted by these new networks. So you have a network effect. You harness the ability of millions. They're self-learning kind of organisms almost. And those old kind of, what we term extraction-based organizations just can't compete. And you can see the seeds of it in Ukraine today.
A friend was telling me the other day that the river attack that made the news a couple of days ago was apparently essentially run on what the rest of us would recognize as Uber, which is that the drone systems identify where the targets are and then put out network calls to the available resources to take on the challenge. And they look for the resources that are the closest to the target and then pass the messages through to them. So that it's essentially network response.
That's right.
I was aware of the fact that when you were talking about all this stuff, you were remarkably low key on what everyone else seems to shout about, which is AI.
Right.
What's your thinking of AI? Because you talked a lot about the price of transport driving towards zero, or transport being available at sort of zero cost, and food costs dropping and resource costs dropping. And if we then start making the cost of everything zero, I'm not quite sure why people need to work. And if you then offload everybody's intelligence requirements onto AI, I'm not sure why you need people to work. So what? Yeah. So if we don't need to work because everything's arriving at our door for free, and if we aren't needed for work because everything's being done by smart systems, then apart from popping out to the pub occasionally, why do I leave home? Yeah,
I mean, great question. So, I mean, it might help to think about what technology is to start with. So I mean, in our the way we look at the world, I mean, the foundations of the physical world are matter, energy, and information, right? And we use technology, we apply knowledge really to matter, energy, to manipulate matter, energy, and information to make the things we need. Right? That's essentially what technology is. It's I guess a practical application of knowledge. And so there are core technologies that we think are kind of going to disrupt everything. There are energy technologies, there are information technologies, and there are sort of material and matter-based technologies, and they all converge and interact in certain ways. And computer processing and AI, critical information technologies, and critical, the AI that disrupts transportation will be the AI that disrupts labor more generally, or part of labor more generally. And it's going to be an extraordinary period. There are risks that come with that, and there always are with these changes, but there are huge opportunities as well. And yes, further out into the future, we will transform the way we think about work. I mean, we'll have our needs met, right? And whatever those needs are, they'll be available very cheaply. So we'll have a new way of providing for each other. So the concept of a universal basic income, which is kind of unaffordable today, will become eminently affordable in the future. These systems that are emerging are really a challenge of capital. They're all upfront cost to build and very little kind of marginal cost. And so the challenge is that capital. And we can talk about that separately. But I mean, the question you asked was about work and labor. And you're right, we'll just reconceive of what work is and what reward is. So, we'll still need, this will be a long, steady period. Not all the jobs won't go tomorrow, but, we'll probably be involved in much more creative or empathetic things. We'll find new ways to give our lives purpose. We'll find all other ways of kind of interacting and building stronger and more resilient communities. So we will, I can't say what that will be in the future, but, we are creative, curious beings. And that'll lead us to do things that we can't even conceive of. Now, I don't think we need to know what those things are today and necessarily plan for them. What we need to plan for is massive change. And so, what I teach my kids really more than anything is to be comfortable with change, to kind of, it's almost a Buddhist philosophy of shedding attachment to the past and attachment to the need for stability.
Jamie, if I can frame what you're saying there, but a couple of questions from elsewhere. So Tom Garnier was asking a question about schooling, and Alex Gatwood's asking a question about employment. And the two questions are kind of related to what you're saying about we're human beings who love being interested, but there's a certain reality that you can't teach old dogs new tricks. So what Alex was wondering is, what are the implications for employment within certain markets? Which market's going to win, which market's going to lose? And what Tom's wanting to know is the obvious follow-on question to that, which is, what do schools like Radley and others do to prepare children to cope with the massive changes that you are suggesting will be happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers. But what I will say is, it could be a great leveler. Energy costs, for instance, in India will be far lower than they will be in the UK or Germany, because they don't have this problem of having to build massive overcapacity to get through winter. So our costs might be 5 or 6 times their costs, and that underpins the rest of the economy. So, there are advantages in certain parts of the world that aren't necessarily the leaders today. But ultimately, to make this transition, to get the benefits of the full systems transformation is not an easy thing for us to do within our current structures. Very difficult for a Western government to totally redesign the way it functions and build a much more kind of integrated, interconnected kind of network system and break out of the silos, essentially, that we currently see the world in. So it's actually, it's one of the reasons why disruption always comes from the edge. Whether it's a company being disrupted or a region being disrupted, it's because of that kind of baggage of incumbency. Those who are doing well, there are lots of interests and incentives and actually the whole mindset that doesn't allow you to change. It's what we're doing today. We rather than recognizing that there's a fundamentally new system emerging, we tend to try and patch up the old. It's kind of like trying to build a faster horse to compete with the car. That's the analogy I would use, is we spend a lot of time trying to improve the old rather than accept that it's fundamentally different. And so I think Western governments, and we write this in our book, will struggle, but there might be some innovators. There might be regions within those areas that can do it. It might be that Texas can go, but not the US federally, for instance. It requires a kind of openness to experimentation. But we're not going to know what the kind of winning formula is, but we need to get going on it.
Sophie, Torrance and Nick Stoop have asked a couple of questions that are related as well. So Sophie's arguing something you just alluded to there, that it's all very well having some of these amazing new technologies, but some of our old technologies, some of our subtractive methods, rather than the additive methods of 3D printing or whatever, some of these subtractive methods actually still scale really well and still cost very little and are highly efficient. Nick Stoop's making the point that all of these new technologies are going to be resource limited in some way, and that there's a limit to how much lithium and cobalt we've found so far. Are these sort of the attractions of sticking with old technologies because we've got the resources and because we've got the know-how? How does that frame around the need of the new technologies to start completely new industries for finding more resources that we aren't necessarily using at scale at the moment? And does this, we saw this with oil and coal, and everybody worried about running out of oil and running out of coal and running out of oil and running out of coal. We never did run out of oil or run out of coal. And so the old industries have just carried on going. What happens if we do run out of lithium and we do run out of cobalt, or will it be the same story? And it is the real lesson for all these young people, is that if you go into geology, you're definitely safe.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's always a story, right? We are hugely innovative and we find new ways to do things. So, the scares of resource scarcity have never come true. And if they do come true, we just find a substitute or something else. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. There never was a peak in oil supply. There was a peak in oil demand, which looks to be in the rearview mirror right now. And I think we'll see, the same in all kinds of other reasons. There isn't a shortage of lithium or any of the other minerals that we need. There's a shortage of processing capacity, right? So we might well see a bottleneck for 2, 3, even 4 years while we ramp that up, because people haven't anticipated how quickly this will happen. We haven't built up the whole value chain. But as people catch up, we'll see massive price spikes and shortages, presumably for a few years. But then over time, the solution to kind of high prices is high prices, right? You get, all the processing and the supply built up, and they drop, and we continue on our merry way down the cost curve. So I don't see any issues longer term. Sure, there are short-term bottlenecks. I mean, God, go back to the kind of the car being, disrupting the horse, right? Back then, there was no oil industry at all, right? And we had to build this. We had to discover oil, discover kind of distilling processes, and so on and so forth, and build a whole industry alongside the car industry. And it was a little bumpy, but we did it, and it barely made a dent in the adoption profile of vehicles. And so, I mean, there's this wonderful book actually that I'd recommend, because these are questions that come up time and time again, written by David Deutsch, who's a sort of I guess the father of quantum computing. It's called the Beginning of Infinity, and he talks about a lot of these issues. And what he really says is progress is essentially infinite. We can do anything that the laws of physics allow. It's really a question of developing the knowledge, and we're on an extraordinary fast trajectory now. But all of these problems are solvable. Ultimately, we'll find new ways of producing energy and so on. But ultimately, every new problem creates every new solution creates new problems. And so the way forward really is he says only progress is truly sustainable. That we solve problems, we create new ones, and we continue to solve them. And at every step, it's unsustainable until redeemed by the next step. And it's this constant progress of process of problem solving. And it's difficult to stand here today and see the potential issues, in the same way I've been standing in 1905 and thought about the issues of having no paved roads, no oil industry, no trained mechanics, no supply chain for cars. It would have looked like we could never scale that industry. But it took 20 years in America to go from less than 5% of the vehicles on the road being cars to being over 95%. Right? That's the S curve, massive change in 20 years. And that happened despite huge obstacles, much bigger than the obstacles we see today to most of these issues. So these tend to be speed bumps rather than kind of obstacles.
Well, Gardner's asking the question. You were talking about universal basic income, and you're talking about our likely successes in the future there. But he's asking the sort of slightly aggressive question that what tends to happen to the profits at the moment in all these amazing startups is they tend to accrue to a few people in Silicon Valley, and the sort of the great unwashed public tend to get a slightly raw deal out of it. And there's certainly people out there who seem to argue that we're drifting back towards some sort of Victorian society where we've got fewer barons at the top and a lot more people at the bottom who are on sort of sustainable levels of income, but not much more. And if that sustainable level of income is universal basic income, you can imagine governments trying to keep universal basic income as low as possible. That word basic will shine through. So how do we make sure that the benefits of these very complex technologies, which require a lot of very smart people to run them, how do we make sure those benefits are fairly distributed?
And that's a critical question, and that's it's what we talk about in our book. And actually, we think there's a potential for inequality to be at a far greater level than it is today. And in really geeky terms, what's ultimately happening in our language is that information is disrupting matter and energy, right? So the valuable part of all these industries are the information platforms, right, that manages this dynamic energy system or the transportation fleet. Car manufacturing becomes commoditized in this world, and so it's less interesting. So all the value accrues to information, and information, suffers from network effects, essentially meaning that you get a winner-take-all dynamic. It's not like economies of scale where you get a number of winners. So yeah, absolutely, there'll be huge, potentially huge inequality. And it's a sort of, we talk about this in Rethinking Humanity. There's a sort of world that might emerge, a kind of dystopia, where we're essentially like caged lions. We're watered and fed and housed. We've got no real freedoms, and there's a zookeeper off there with all the money and all the profits, and absolutely, and that's really, that's what will happen if we just have a transformation of our production system without the way we organize society changing. But I guess what we're saying is we have the potential to change society in a fundamental way, in the way we didn't have before, right? So, a much more equal distribution of profits is possible. It hasn't historically been possible because society is in a kind of world of extraction, the old model, which has existed for the history of civilization. If you don't kind of incentivize progress, you kind of get outgrown and outcompeted by someone who does. And this is why communism and this is why countries or regions that have tried to live too sustainably or too equitably have failed. They've been overtaken by others who haven't, because that's the driver, that's the incentive in the kind of world of scarcity. When you're not in a world of scarcity, that kind of dynamic disappears. So it's a critical issue, and we need to make sure and do everything we can to make sure it happens. But there will be some real dystopias in parts of the world. What we hope is.
I mean, Ed Charles is asking that question along with other people who are all wanting you to tell them what they should invest in next. But Ed's making the interesting point. What's your view on environmental and social investment strategies? How do we incentivize markets to be more enthusiastic about doing the right thing rather than simply following, as what you're suggesting, a sort of capitalist competitive market, which is almost bound to encourage people to slightly do the wrong thing so that, as you say, they can avoid some of the constraints that environment and social pressures will bring on them. The winners will be the people who tend to ignore those constraints. And that's something that our current government is sort of doubling down on, isn't it? Is let's remove constraints. But does that really work to the best of society? And how do we encourage more pressure on the right solution?
I struggle with this because I come from that world. I spent a lot of time in kind of clean tech investing and that kind of world. And I think it's a difference of viewpoint, right, as to whether this is about top-down solutions imposed from above or whether they're bottom up. And I kind of, the analogy I'd use is that, the way I see it is that, the boulder's at the top of the hill, and the job of government and regulation is to give it a shove and get it rolling down the hill. And that might be by, subsidizing prices so that they become competitive earlier and they get on those cost curves, and then market forces take over. And the other job is to make sure that as the boulder trundles down the hill, it doesn't do too much damage, right? Protect the communities and the people that are affected by change. That's a really important piece of this. I think that there's a sort of top-down perspective to these issues where, we kind of feel like we're at the bottom of the hill and we've got to, struggle to push the boulder up the hill, and using all available resources, whereas tax and regulation and restrictions on consumption and all kinds of things. And I just don't think we're in that place. I think that sort of all of the above approach is the wrong and can lead us down the wrong alleyway. Actually, we can end up doing stuff that we think is helpful that actually takes us off track and is deeply unhelpful. I think the ESG movement is a good one, and I think it's an important one, but it's about making sure that these disruptions, that market forces will be the primary deliverer of this new system, and that's a good thing, right? Because that's what always disrupts industries, and it's the job of ESG and regulation and so on to keep them on track and just make sure that we're not causing kind of unexpected or unwanted damage as we go along. But it's not the primary driver of this change.
Katrina Quinton's making the point that the changing society is a bit different from changing human nature, and that cage lions, as you talk about, might actually start to bite back. How do we persuade society that things are going to change and they need to change with them? I mean, I guess it to some extent comes back to Tom Garnier's point about what the schools need to do, and to other points about how do we persuade old dogs to perform new tricks, or do we only get new dogs to perform the new tricks? In which case, how do we pension off all the old dogs who aren't keen to embrace, microbe proteins and three-dimensional printers in their houses?
Yeah, I'm not not sure I have a perfect answer for that. I think the education question is a really good one. I think there's I don't think anyone would argue that we're going to see massive transformation and maybe a change to really what education means and how it. I mean, education will be disrupted in terms of how it's delivered, but also what is delivered, right? And so both mechanisms will be changed. And I think there's a potential for there's no reason now with the technology we have for anyone in the world to have a bad teacher or a suboptimal teacher. Really, we should have the best teaching everywhere in the world. In terms of what we teach, it's kind of difficult to know. I think there's I think it's Moravec's paradox, which says what's easy for us is difficult for AI, and what's difficult for AI is easy for us. So things like fine motor skills and empathy and creativity, we do naturally, super difficult for AI. Things like advanced mathematics and physics and engineering, actually much easier for AI because they're kind of rules based. So it might be that we concentrate on the eventually, and I'm not saying STEM isn't important now, of course it is, but 10, 20, 30 years out, actually having the collaborative skills, having the personal skills, having the empathetic skills, and actually doing everything we can to work on and amplify our creativity, I think is going to be super interesting. I mean super important. I mean, those people who find change difficult will be the ones who struggle. And those who aren't kind of curious and interested and motivated will find it very difficult. And I think that's the role of schools.
Here's a frightening thought. What if the people who find change difficult are 60-year-old dinosaur teachers like me who aren't exposed on a daily basis to the sort of discussions that you're involved with? And so we're the ones who aren't driving change because it's not in our interest to do that. And we're not seeing much change coming at us. Yeah. Do you think part of the problem might be that our education system isn't exposed to enough of the messages that are coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, disruption comes from the edge. So, I mean, I think it's much harder for Radley or Oxford or, any big institution to disrupt themselves. I think what will happen is we'll see disruption come from the edge. We'll see new models emerge that begin to disrupt you, and you'll be forced to adapt. I mean, it tends to be the way. So, and that's the point about this. This is a sort of bottom-up emergent process in some ways, rather than one we kind of plan from the top down. And it's, that's difficult. But I think that, the secret for Radley is to be aware of what's going. Don't be like kind of VW or BMW, these businesses that ignored electric vehicles until it was far too late, and now are desperately scrabbling to catch up. But they're building, they still haven't understood what the real disruption is, so they need to become software companies. And so it's really about just thinking much more broadly and being aware of what's possible.
There's a great book by Geoffrey West you may have read called Scale. He's a physicist absolutely. Talking about the way that scale impacts on animals and on businesses and on cities. And I was amused by you mentioning Radley and Oxford in the same breath there, because Radley is about 150 years old and 175 years old. It's in fact precisely 175 years old now I think about it. And some of the businesses you've just mentioned, have been lucky to last that long. And one of the points that West makes in his book is that companies don't always survive. But he makes the point that cities do, and it's hard not to notice that Oxford University has actually managed to survive for the best part of 1,000 years, and it seems to have coped with disruption pretty well. So what's the difference between, companies full of really smart people that don't seem to cope and university type cities that seem to just keep trundling along for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, despite the fact that if you look at them from the outside, you'd say there's lots of very sort of dull academics in those institutions who aren't very influenced by the reality of what you're talking about.
Yeah, but I think it's a difference between a hierarchy and a kind of distributed. It's almost, a a distributed organism at some level. You know, I mean, cities go bankrupt and they fail and they have all kinds of problems over time, but they reorganize and they adapt. And you know, in the same way that nature does and ecosystems do. And I think that sort of distributed structure helps them. And universities, you know, I mean, I remember hearing universities described as a bunch of professors connected by a communal heating system or something. I mean, it is a kind of distributed system by its nature, right? And I think that's much more adaptable. I think where you get hierarchical structures, kind of command and control, very difficult to adapt. Very good in those equilibrium phases, right, where nothing much is changing and all you're doing is, you know, working on selling more or reducing your costs. I mean, great for command and control. But in a period of change, and every sector of the economy and every part of society is about to go through that, you need these much more distributed learning organizations that can feed. You know, we talk about kind of building organizations as mycelium networks, right? You don't want a real center. You want to be sharing information and resources across a network and responding to threats and opportunities in a way that you can't do through kind of command and control.
Yeah, that is really interesting. The idea that society goes in kinds of peaks and troughs between equilibrium type positions and then dramatic change, and that you need different management structures at the time. And we've only got
different ways of thinking. Yeah, and different ways of thinking. Yeah.
I want to give you the last couple of minutes because we're going to finish at 7. And Jamie, I want you to just gather your thoughts as to what are the 3 key points you'd like us to take away. But I do want to just quote what Ed Giles has just put onto the chat, which is he makes the very obvious observation that the fact that we're all sitting on Zoom listening to this talk is in itself a pretty good example of major disruption happening in 2022. With that thought in mind, you know, what are the 3 things you'd want us to absolutely take away, Jamie? In particular, you know, bearing in mind we've all got a link to Radley and we've all got an interest in education.
Yeah, I guess the key points, you know, 1, you know, change is coming at us fast. You know, 2, the impact of that change is going to be far greater and far more profound, I think, than most people realize. But thirdly, the biggest barrier to change are our kind of mindsets, the way we see the world, that this desire for kind of safety and stability that makes us want to patch up the old rather than accelerate the new. And I think that's, you know, that's the biggest threat, is that we cling on to what we had and try and kind of patch it up and rebuild it. And we don't understand that actually there's something much better that could come. But, you know, it's a totally different world. It's a bottom-up world and not a top-down world. And I think mindset's our biggest challenge going forward.
Final question on exactly that then. If you had to choose between the 2, well-being or resilience?
I mean, you know, you can't separate them. They feed into each other. They're interconnected.
Well, I'm going to leave it at that, Jamie. That was really, really interesting. And thank you so much for answering all those questions and for giving us such a helpful guide to the scary and crazy place that the world is becoming, as you so nicely put it. A huge thank you on behalf of all of those of us who are online, and a sort of huge round of applause in the sort of silent way that happens on Zoom at this point. And can I, having said thank you, hand back to Caroline?
Absolutely. I just want to echo my thanks. Thanks to you, Ian. You were an excellent compare. Really good to hear you and Jamie sparring. And thanks, Jamie, so much for your time, because I know you're exceedingly busy, as are you, Ian, of course. So the next big thinking talk will be in June. More details on the topic to follow, and we hope to see you on the call then. So just enjoy the rest of your sunny evening, and thanks for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye.